As many Americans celebrate Black History Month, there is uncertainty and concern with diversity, equity, and inclusion at stake. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. It's been 99 years since the African-American historian and author Carter G. Woodson founded Negro History Week, a yearly event that would later grow to become Black History Month, marked every February. Over decades, Black pride swelled in tandem with increased opportunities, but now new headwinds after U.S. President Donald Trump banned diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in the federal government, and many private employers followed suit. To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Jacquie Luqman is coordinator for the Black Alliance for Peace, D.C. Also in the U.S. Capitol, Imani Cheers is an associate professor of digital storytelling at George Washington University. From Maryland, Joseph Williams is a former senior editor for U.S. News and World Report, and Nyambi Carter is an associate professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Nyambi Carter, let me start with you. On day one of his presidency, President Trump ended government programs that promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are programs better known as DEI. Trump called them, quote, and I'm quoting him here, forced, illegal, and immoral discrimination programs, unquote. What is this going to mean? What impact is this going to have?
Well, thank you for having me. Look, Donald Trump has, periodically weaponized these terms that are about trying to make America live up to its promise. DEI is the latest of these. We've heard this with all that kerfuffle over critical race theory. And now he is more emboldened. And he clearly has a Congress that is willing to kowtow to this, but also lots of private firms are sort of bending to this whim of Donald Trump and preemptively taking DEI off the docket. I mean, I think this is stuff we've seen before. I mean, this kind of backlash is not new. I think Donald Trump wants to take a sledgehammer, if he can, to anything that looks like a Black middle class, but not just Black people, anything that brings equity to marginalized communities. That's disabled people, that's LGBTQ+, particularly trans people. So Donald Trump has been very clear about what he wants to do, but he is more than happy to let Black people sort of be the face of this effort, because that's a way to gin up a lot of support. But DEI is about more than race, and certainly about more than Black folks.
Imani, cheers. These are not just slogans, these have real-world implications. Trump also targeted parts of the Equal Employment Opportunity Act and eliminated all equity programs going back right to 1965. How detrimental are these actions going to be?
Well, what I'd like to remind everyone is that nothing that's happening currently is anything new, and it shouldn't be anything surprising. Project 2025 was public information for over a year now. And so all of the things that we're seeing, what should have been happening, instead of outrage, we should have opportunities to prepare and respond. And of course, I mean, the notion of rolling back and eliminating, as the colleague said right before me, attempting to again continue to erase these efforts of America living up to its promise of true equality is something we're going to see. So it's going to be detrimental. But again, for those who were paying attention, we knew that this was going to be detrimental, which is why we were so hell-bent, so proactive and not wanting to have this administration in power. And so what we are seeing now, and what we will continue to see, is swift erasure of progress, an attempt to make white America, quote unquote, great again, that excludes anyone, women, anyone who is not a cisgendered white male.
Imani, you say the opportunities to prepare and respond were missed. What should have been done?
I think we should have had, I mean, there were bells, whistles, alarms being since early 2024. And again, the way in which Donald Trump's campaign was able to, again, their narrative was never about the erasure of minority and historically marginalized communities, but it was talking about the price of eggs, which, as all of us know, has not decreased. In fact, it's increased. And so, what should have been done is the Democrats, in particular, a more concerted effort to establish and make truly everyone, instead of pandering to the wide swath of contingencies that are in the Democratic Party, there should have been a clearer focus. The way in which the Republicans and the GOP have always had a clear focus, and that was clearly established with Project 2025.
Joseph Williams, I want to play you two sound clips. One is from President Trump. The other is from the House Minority Leader, Hakeem Jeffries, who is himself African-American. Let's listen to them.
My administration has taken action to abolish all discriminatory diversity, equity, and inclusion nonsense. And these are policies that were absolute nonsense throughout the government and the private sector.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion are American values. It's about economic opportunity for everyone. We support merit for everyone, based on what you know, not who you know.
So, Joseph, listening to the language that President Trump used there, he said discriminatory. Now, black people make up a larger share of the federal workforce, 18.6%. Black people also have the highest unemployment rate and are at risk, the greatest risk, of job losses. Yet, the term DEI is, as we just heard, considered discriminatory against whites. I mean, how does one explain that?
Two things explain it. The Supreme Court's decisions over time that says that anything that promotes equity, anything that helps black people get ahead or helps them kind of negate the kind of suppression that we've had to deal with for hundreds of years is detrimental to white people. So that's been a reverse discrimination argument on its face. The second thing is that any kind of private sector attempts to make up for lost ground and to help black people be on equal footing with white people, same thing. So it explains it in the federal government, in the courts, they have ruled that way. That's bled over to the public, and DEI has become a weaponized term. And I think that people, much like critical race theory, people have got it definitely wrong. I mean, it doesn't mean diversity, equity, and inclusion does not mean promotion of ill-equipped minorities ahead of better qualified white people. It means leveling the playing field, giving people a chance, and choosing diversity as opposed to homogeneity. It also means that we're given an opportunity for everybody to shine, that it's not just one people, it's just not monolithic. And I think Donald Trump himself would probably struggle to explain it, particularly after seeing some of his cabinet nominees. I mean, some of them are blatantly unqualified for the jobs that they now hold, and they were promoted without cease by the president, even though it boggles the mind that somebody like Robert F. Kennedy is in charge of health, somebody like the defense secretary Hegseth is in charge of the military. I mean, that's racism, if you ask me. That's promotion without qualification. DEI does none of that. As a matter of fact, the black experience in America has always been that you must be overqualified to even be considered for a position, much less actually hired. And overperformance has been the hallmark of any black professional will tell you that that's been their experience in the workforce. So I think to suggest that this is something that is nefarious or kind of a way to sneak black people in who aren't qualified is patently ludicrous, particularly given the current political climate that we're in.
Jacquie Luqman, as Joseph said, the term DEI has become weaponized in so many ways. There was an opinion piece in the Guardian newspaper which says DEI has become the new N-word, a new right-wing attack. What do you think is happening here, and what is the political impact of this?
Well, what's happening now is that the same thing that has been happening in this country since the founding of the country, certainly since the end of slavery and Reconstruction, where everything that was done to address the inequality that was created by
nearly 3 centuries of slavery and the theft of wages, the lack of resources of the formerly enslaved populations, the racial terrorism, the violence that not only took people's lives, but stole their property and their money, which creates the continuing legacy of inequality that we experience today. Well, with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the same arguments that Trump and his acolytes are using now against things like DEI and CRT and the word woke, the Guardian is correct. Though they are using those words to turn them into epithets against us. But this is not new. Since the Civil Rights Act was passed, these same arguments were used against every provision of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, against the Equal Employment Opportunity Act. All of these things, all of these lies about unqualified Black people being pulled into jobs that they don't deserve over undeserving white people, that's always been a lie, but that's always been the lie that has been told. I think the issue that we have had is we have kept trying to appeal to the morality of people who clearly have none, because they refuse to deal with the actual history of this country. They know it, they just don't want to acknowledge that it still has an impact on this society today, and they do not want to address it at all. So I think our response needs to be with facts, with data, instead of, saying things that are just not true, like diversity, equality, and inclusion are American values. They're clearly not.
Ricardo, I want to get back to something you said earlier on and that Joseph spoke about a moment ago, and that is, to what extent has this term DEI been distorted to the extent where people see it as purely a race term, whereas, as Joseph pointed out, it's not to do with race only, it's about leveling the playing field, it's about attracting diversity.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a very important and subtle trick, because if you can hyper identify this term, which is not a singular thing, right? But it's about a set of provisions that make sure, whether we're doing hiring or recruitment and those kinds of things, that we are seeking a broad net for the most qualified people that we can get. People that we might not typically look at because of a range of reasons. Maybe they didn't go to the right school, or maybe they don't live in the neighborhoods where we would normally recruit. Those kinds of things, that we actually are bringing those people in, and that includes rural communities and other things. But if you can hyper identify the term DEI with Black people, then it's a lot easier to get people upset, because, as my colleagues have aptly pointed out, ever since Black people have gotten a little bit of a foothold in this country, there has been a ready and willing contingent of folks who have decried any effort to look at justice, because any kind of bit of justice to them looks like or feels like injustice, because they've always been the dominant one. But people forget, though, is that when Black people have gotten these things, whether we're talking about equal employment, civil rights, they've also brought a lot of people with them, women, white women in particular, beneficiaries of affirmative action. When we talk about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 64 and 65, we also got immigration reform. I think of those things as important moments. But if you can get enough people to think about DEI as just another way to do an end run, right, around qualified whites and take something away from whites, then they can get really upset, because a lot of this is just sort of, we want to guard against potential loss. We're not talking about real losses to white wealth or white overrepresentation in most institutions in this country. It's an attempt to guard against that potential, right? Because whites are very concerned about how many white children are being born in this country. This is what people like Elon Musk and other natalists are concerned about. All of this stuff is about preserving America as a white nation that serves primarily white identified people. And I think anything to the contrary, or any suggestion otherwise, is to be to tell a lie, quite frankly. And so that's why making DEI Black discrimination or anti-white discrimination in another name is why that has been such a successful kind of trope.
So, Imani, cheers. Here we have something that is happening in the 21st century, the first quarter of the 21st century. It's 2025. This year also marks 99 years since Carter Woodson conceived and announced Negro History Week. Of course, that, as I pointed out, has expanded into Black History Month. That happened in 1976. I'm wondering if I could ask you to play time traveler here and tell us, what do you think, how Woodson would react to what is happening right now?
I think he would be surprised at all. I think he'd be very frustrated that 100 years of perceived progress in one fell swoop. In 8 years after the presidency of the first Black man to hold that office, that this is where we would be. But then again, I think that's where, I look at Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project, which is something that I use as an educational tool with my students, as a way to really counter these whitewashed narratives of American history. And I think when you really understand and look at the totality of this nation, and you look at who this nation has supported abroad, the policies and procedures that they have put in place since its founding, where we are today should not be any surprise or shock to anyone. And as someone who spent her formative years in post-apartheid South Africa, I even see how that conversation, which is not the conversation for this evening, but even where you hear President Trump talking about offering refugee status to minority white Afrikaner farmers, and inflaming and conflating information. The real issue we have in this country truly goes back to what I believe is not only critical thinking, but also fundamental literacy. Fundamental literacy, because if you actually read and understood the historical nature of this country, contemporarily, you would not be surprised by anything. Carter G. Woodson would not be shocked. Again, I think he would be saddened, but I don't think he would be shocked to see where we are, because the fight for what he established almost 100 years ago, we're still continuing to fight, and we will continue his mission, because you cannot erase Black people in this country. You cannot erase Black history, whatever you want to call it. If you want to weaponize woke, you want to weaponize terms like DEI, you want to misappropriate terms such as critical race theory, and Kimberly Crenshaw's work there. But the reality is we have a critical thinking issue. We have a literacy issue in this country. And I am not talking about children. I am talking about voting age adults. Who make choices based on either one or two issues that are centered to them, but we don't think as a community.
Jacquie Luqman, we're also seeing the line between the political establishment and corporate America blurred in many, many ways. I mean, if we take a company like Google, for instance, it's a giant tech company, one of the biggest in the world, which has a fair number of very lucrative federal contracts. It has removed Black History Month from its calendar. It also removed Pride Month. And when Google was asked about it, it says it got feedback that some other countries and events were missing, and maintaining hundreds of commemorations was unsustainable. What do you make of that?
That's a blatant lie, and we all know that's a blatant lie. When we're looking at the response of private corporations to Trump's executive order about DEI, remember, private corporations are not under the purview of executive orders. They are issued as guidelines or, rules changes to the federal workforce. That's the purview. So the private corporations began rolling back their DEI efforts as far back as 2020. Even though many corporations implemented some of these DEI efforts, some of these DEI programs, they said in response to the uprising in the streets among the people to racist police terrorism, yet again. So some companies did implement these programs, but as soon as conservatives mounted an organized effort, and this is where the criticisms of the terms CRT and woke and DEI began to come around, then corporations started rolling back their DEI efforts then. So none of the corporations that responded to Trump's executive order, including Google, with changing their map from the Gulf of Mexico, which is what the body of water is called by every other country in the world, to the Gulf of America, Google didn't have to do that. They were under no legal requirement to do that. And this, I have argued, should cause us to question our insistence and reliance on not just the government that has been responsible for our continued oppression, but also corporations that we understand are really the entities that control the government. We live in a kleptocracy, and we also live in an oligarchy where the rich are controlling the government. That includes corporations. So the corporations are setting the narrative. The Republicans under Trump are issuing the orders, and they are working in tandem with each other without any kind of, particularly with the corporations, without any kind of legal impetus to do anything different. So we should be asking ourselves, why are they obeying orders that are not from them? And then we should be asking of ourselves, why do we keep thinking that corporations are benign entities outside of politics that we could ever trust to express or reflect our interests? This moment should be very clear to us that if our history is important to us, we are the ones who are responsible for telling our history. We cannot leave that up to anybody else.
All right, Judith Williams, we sometimes look at programs like DEI, we think of it as, turning points in a nation's history, but I'm looking at something else now, which is, the landmark Civil Rights Act. Could that be the next target?
Well, it already has been a target. President Trump has kind of hollowed it out. The Voting Rights Act, in fact, was hollowed out by the Supreme Court, almost three quarters of which that he appointed. So it's really not that much of a stretch. I mean, talk about South Africa. I mean, it seems like we're moving backwards in time towards a system of apartheid here in America that's going to be resurrected. Now, the big problem that I have here is not necessarily with conservatives. I mean, we kind of know where they're at. We know that conservatives don't really like this. We don't really like equal rights. They don't really like these sorts of things because it gets in the way of profits. But I think what the frustrating thing about it is that we have a lot of moderate people. We have a lot of even some liberal people who are willing and content to sit on their hands and not make a fuss because it doesn't necessarily affect them. I mean, we've always been a country of conflict, starting from the way the country was founded was on conflict, but they're afraid and averse to conflict here because they know if they get on the wrong side of the issue, it could mean trouble for them. Thinking about some of the prosecutors who went after Donald Trump, thinking about some of the judges who went after Donald Trump. So even expanding it a little bit larger than just basically civil rights, we've got a problem here with people not really standing up for the rule of law, which sweeps in Black America. So I think there's a lot to be concerned about, not just with race in America, but with the way the system is kind of crumbling around us, and there are not enough good people to stand up and stop it. Republicans are those people. We don't see anything like it. We don't see anything like the party that supposedly stands up for equality even coming close to thinking that they can do something for Black America, even though they try to recruit Black people every 4 years, every 2 years when they're running for office, and it never really works to any degree of efficacy.
Nyambi, as Jackie pointed out a moment ago, big corporations, the one I mentioned was Google, but they are under no legal obligation to cut these programs as well. As a result of many of these big multinationals cutting these programs, there are many people who are calling for a boycott of these businesses that have cut their DEI programs. How effective would that be? Where do you see that going?
Well, I mean, I think Jackie's exactly right. A lot of these people are cutting bait, thinking about what they could get down the line, right? Whether we're talking about government contracts or just, the special cookies that becomes from being next to the man, being invited to inaugurations, etc. I mean, I think divesting is always an important ethical move, particularly when you think about where you're going to spend your dollars or where you're going to spend your time. I think the reality is that some of these companies are so ubiquitous, they're still going to keep clicking along. It won't necessarily hobble them in the same way. But I do think that people of conscience have a right and should exercise whatever means of resistance is there for them. And where you spend your money is one of those places that you can do that. Instead of going to the big box retailers, you might think about going to your local shop. And it might be harder for some people to do that than others. So I'm not suggesting some sort of purity tests here. But if you think like, you can't get over using, your 2-day shipping, you might want to say, well, maybe I just need to head to the mall and go get that thing myself because, I don't want to give this person another cent. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, that depends on a lot of other people doing that too for it to really matter. But I do think it's worth searching your own self and being able to say, like, I may not be able to do everything. I'm only one person. But I think that's what a lot of people want you to think. It's like, you're only one person. What can you really do? But it's like, well, I'm just not going to spend my money here. You won't miss my, few dollars as a single person. So if people's conscience leads them there, I think boycotts can be very effective. I think they can be very important. And I think, it is one of many methods that people could use to potentially let their their anger, their righteous anger, be known.
Imani, education has also been at the core of Black History Month. Education to safeguard history. I mean, is enough being done as in education to preserve what is an essential part of this country's history? A part that some would like to forget.
Absolutely. I mean, there was literally a couple of weeks ago, Hillman Talk. There was a group of Black professors who were getting together on TikTok to provide accurate information on a variety of humanities and business science topics. So education is core. And that's what I mentioned earlier in terms of really focusing and getting to work. There are the 92% of us, in particular Black women, who did not vote for Donald Trump in November's election. We saw this coming. We understood how detrimental a Trump Part 2 presidency, with him having no accountability for any of his actions. We knew pardons were coming. We knew these sweeping executive orders were going to come down. So I think it's really, we've been preparing, planning, and we will continue to promote and engage and present our history.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arlen Bynum in Washington, D.C.
You might think you are better informed in an information age. The fact is, people are more often misled by misinformation. You might think every voice is heard in a digital world. The fact is, many nations and peoples are still underrepresented. And data poverty shuts out many. We at CGTN are committed to transcending the information gap and the digital divide. CGTN, bridging nations and civilizations. CGTN, see the difference.